Hello, alchemists. Welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas Life Alchemist, and I'm here for another episode of The Body Keeps the Score. We are going to be continuing with week 14 this week. This is a book by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma. If this is your first time joining me for this series, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. It may be in your best interest to start with week 1 because I am moving through this book. So there's a lot that's already transpired. So you may want to go back to week 1. What else? Oh, yes, very important news. I started a Patreon and I would love for you all to check it out. There's exclusive content. There's going to be bi-weekly Q&As where I'll be pulling cards, a monthly newsletter, also monthly personalized oracle reading. And if you sign up for level 3 alchemist, then you actually are in the coaching tier. So you'll get one-on-one time with me. You'll get personalized intentions, planning the month out for areas of opportunity for growth and development. And then we'll also do a wrap-up session at the end of the month to see where you're at, what we want to tweak, and where we want to move forward with that. So, you also get discounts in my partner's stores. So Liz, in her Etsy shop, Olivera by Elizabeth, and then also Dory's shop, Soulstone Organizers, which is also on Etsy as well. You will get discounts there. And I believe that's everything. Okay, you all. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So, I didn't mention, I'm going to drop the link for my Patreon in the description box below. I don't know if I already said that, but I'm saying it now. So I would love to have you join me. And you get early access to YouTube videos as well. So yeah, alrighty, let's get started. We're picking up on page 251, and it's called EMDR First Exposures. Like many scientific advances, EMDR originated with a chance observation. One day in 1987, psychologist Francine Shapiro was walking through a park preoccupied with some painful memories when she noticed that rapid eye movements produced a dramatic relief from her distress. How could a major treatment modality grow from such a brief experience? How is it possible that such a simple process had not been noted before? Initially skeptical about her observation, she subjected her method to years of experimentation and research, gradually building it into a standardized procedure that could be taught and tested in controlled studies. I arrived from my first EMDR training in need of some trauma processing myself. A few weeks earlier, the Jesuit priest who was chair of my department at Massachusetts General Hospital had suddenly shut down the trauma clinic, leaving us scrambling for a new site and new funds to treat our patients, train our students, and conduct our research. At around the same time, my friend Frank Putnam, who was doing the long-term study of sexually abused girls that I discussed in chapter 10, was fired from the National Institutes of Health, and Rick Cluft, the country's foremost expert on dissociation, lost his unit at the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital. It might have been all a coincidence, but it felt as if my whole world was under attack. My distress about the trauma clinic seemed like a good test for my EMDR trial. While I was following my partner's fingers with my eyes, a rapid succession of fuzzy childhood scenes came to mind. Intense family dinner table conversations, confrontations with schoolmates during recess, throwing pebbles at a shed window with my older brother. All of them the sort of vivid, floating, hypnopompic images we experience when we slumber late on a Sunday morning, then forget the moment we fully awaken. After about half an hour, my fellow trainee and I revisited the scene in which my boss told me that he was closing my clinic. Now I felt resigned. Okay, it happened, and now it's time to move on. I never looked back. The clinic later reconstituted itself and has thrived ever since. Was EMDR the sole reason I was able to let go of my anger and distress? Of course, I'll never know for certain, but my mental journey through unrelated childhood scenes to putting the episode to rest was unlike anything I had experienced in talk therapy. What happened next, when it was my turn to administer EMDR, was even more intriguing. We rotated to a different group, and my new fellow student, whom I'd never met before, told me he wanted to address some painful childhood incidents involving his father, but he did not want to discuss them. I had never worked on anybody's trauma without knowing the story, and I was annoyed and flustered by his refusal to share any details. While I was moving my fingers in front of his eyes, he looked intensely distressed. He began sobbing, and his breathing became rapid and slow. But each time I asked him the questions that the protocol called for, he refused to tell me what came to his mind. At the end of our 45-minute session, the first thing my colleague said was that he'd found dealing with me so unpleasant that he would never refer a patient to me. Otherwise, he remarked, the EMDR session had resolved the matter of his father's abuse. While I was skeptical and suspected that his rudeness toward me was a carryover from unresolved feelings toward his father, there was no question that he appeared much more relaxed. I turned to my EMDR trainer, Gerald Puck, and told him how flummoxed I was. This man clearly did not like me and had looked profoundly distressed during the EMDR session. But now he was telling me that his long-standing misery was gone. How could I possibly know what he had or had not resolved if he was unwilling to tell me what had happened during the session? Jerry smiled and asked if by chance I had become a mental health professional in order to solve some of my own personal issues. I confirmed that most people who knew me thought that might be the case. Then he asked if I found it meaningful when people told me their trauma stories. Again, I had to agree with him. Then he said, you know, Bessel, maybe you need to learn to put your voyeuristic tendencies on hold. If it's important for you to hear trauma stories, why don't you go to a bar, put a couple of dollars on the table and say to your neighbor, I'll buy you a drink if you tell me your trauma story. But you really need to know the difference between your desire to hear stories and your patient's internal process of healing. I took Jerry's admonition to heart and ever since have enjoyed repeating it to my students. I left my EMDR training preoccupied with 3 issues that fascinate me to this day. 1, EMDR loosens up something in the mind-brain that gives people rapid access to loosely associated memories and images from the past. This seems to help them put the traumatic experience into a larger context or perspective. 2, people may be able to heal from trauma without talking about it. EMDR enables them to observe their experiences in a new way without verbal give and take with another person. And 3, EMDR can help even if the patient and the therapist do not have a trusting relationship. This is particularly intriguing because trauma, understandably, rarely leaves people with an open, trusting heart. In the years since, I have done EMDR with patients who spoke Swahili, Mandarin, and Breton, all languages in which I can only say, notice that, the key EMDR instruction. I always had a translator available, but primarily to explain the steps of the process, because EMDR doesn't require patients to speak, but about the intolerable, or explain to a therapist why they feel upset. It allows them to stay fully focused on their internal experience with sometimes extraordinary results. Okay, next section on page 253 called Studying EMDR. The trauma clinic who was saved by a manager at the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health who had followed our work with children and now asked us to take on the task of organizing the community trauma response team for the Boston area. That was enough to cover our basic operations, and the rest was supplied by an energetic staff who loved what we were doing, including the newly discovered power of EMDR to cure some of the patients whom we'd been unable to help before. My colleagues and I began to show one another videotapes of our EMDR sessions with PTSD patients, which enabled us to observe dramatic week-by-week improvements when we started to formally measure our progress on a standard PTSD scale. We then started to formally measure their progress on a standard PTSD rating scale. We also arranged with Elizabeth Matthew, a young neuroimaging specialist at the New England Deaconess Hospital, to have 12 patients' brains scanned before and after their treatment. After only 3 EMDR sessions, 8 of the 12 had shown significant decrease in their PTSD scores. On their scans, we could see a sharp increase in prefrontal lobe activation after treatment, as well as much more activity in the anterior cingulate and the basal ganglia. The shift could account for the difference in how they now experience their trauma. One man reported, I remembered it as though it was a real memory, but it was more distant. Typically, I drown in it, but this time I was floating on top. I had the feeling that I was in control. A woman told us, before I felt each and every step of it. Now it was like a whole instead of fragments, so it was more manageable. The trauma had lost its immediacy and became a story about something that had happened a long time ago. We subsequently secured funding from the National Institute of Mental Health to compare the effects of EMDR with standard doses of Prozac or a placebo. Of our 88 patient subjects, 30 received EMDR, 28 Prozac, and the rest the sugar pill. As often happens, the people placed on placebo did well. After 8 weeks, their 42% improvement was greater than that for many other treatments that are promoted as quote unquote evidence-based. The group on Prozac did slightly better than the placebo group, but barely so. This is typical of most studies of drugs for PTSD. Simply showing up brings about a 30% to 42% improvement. When drugs work, they add an additional 5% to 15%. However, the patients on EMDR did substantially better than those on either Prozac or the placebo. After 8 EMDR sessions, 1 in 4 were completely cured. Their PTSD scores had dropped to negligible levels compared with 1 in 10 of the Prozac group. But the real difference occurred over time. When we interviewed our subjects 8 months later, 60% of those who had received EMDR scored as being completely cured. As the great psychiatrist Milton Erickson said, once you kick the log, the river will start flowing. Once people started to integrate their traumatic memories, they spontaneously continued to improve. In contrast, all those who had taken Prozac relapsed when they went off the drug. This study was significant because it demonstrated what a focused, trauma-specific therapy for PTSD like EMDR could be much more effective than medication. Other studies have confirmed that if patients take Prozac or related drugs like Celexa, Paxil, and Zoloft, their PTSD symptoms often improve, but only as long as they keep taking them. This makes drug treatment much more expensive in the long run. Interestingly, despite Prozac's status as a major antidepressant, in our study, EMDR also produced a greater reduction in depression scores than taking the antidepressant. Another key finding in our study, adults with histories of childhood trauma responded very differently to EMDR than those who were traumatized as adults. At the end of 8 weeks, almost half of the adult onset group that received EMDR scored as completely cured, while only 9% of the child abuse group showed much pronounced improvement. 8 months later, the cure rate was 73% for the adult onset group, compared with 25% for those with histories of child abuse. The child abuse group had small but consistently positive responses to Prozac. The results reinforced the findings that I reported in Chapter 9. Chronic child abuse causes very different mental and biological adaptations than discrete traumatic events in adulthood. EMDR is a powerful treatment for stuck traumatic memories, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the effects of the betrayal and abandonment that accompany physical or sexual abuse in childhood. 8 weeks of therapy of any kind is rarely sufficient to resolve the legacy of longstanding trauma. As of 2014, our EMD study had the most positive outcome of any published study of people who developed their PTSD in reaction to a traumatic event as an adult. But despite these results and those of dozens of other studies, many of my colleagues continued to be skeptical about EMDR, perhaps because it seems too good to be true, too simple to be powerful. I surely can understand that sort of skepticism. EMDR is an unusual procedure. Interestingly, it is the first solid scientific study using EMDR in combat veterans with PTSD. EMDR was expected to do so poorly that it was included as the control condition for comparison with biofeedback-assisted relaxation therapy. To the researchers' surprise, 12 sessions of EMDR turned out to be the more effective treatment. EMDR has since become one of the treatments for PTSD sanctioned by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Okie doke. Next section, this is page 255, and it's called, Is EMDR a Form of Exposure Therapy? Some psychologists have hypothesized that EMDR actually desensitizes people to the traumatic material and thus is related to exposure therapy. A more accurate description would be that it integrates the traumatic material. As our research showed, after EMDR, people thought of the trauma as a coherent event in the past, instead of experiencing sensations and images divorced from any context. Memories evolve and change. Immediately after a memory is laid down, it undergoes a lengthy process of integration and reinterpretation, a process that automatically happens in the mind-brain without any input from the conscious self. When the process is complete, the experience is integrated with other life events and stops having a life of its own. As we have seen in PTSD, this process fails and the memory remains stuck, undigested, and raw. Unfortunately, few psychologists are taught during their training how the memory processing system in the brain works. This omission can lead to misguided approaches to treatment. In contrast to phobias, such as a spider phobia, which is based on a specific irrational fear, post-traumatic stress is the result of a fundamental reorganization of the central nervous system based on having experienced an actual threat of annihilation or seeing someone else being annihilated, which reorganizes self-experience as helpless and the interpretation of reality, the entire world is a dangerous place. During exposure, patients initially become extremely upset. As they revisit the traumatic experience, they show sharp increases in their heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones. But if they manage to stay in the treatment and keep reliving their trauma, they slowly become less reactive and less prone to disintegrate when they recall the event. As a result, they get lower scores on their PTSD ratings. However, as far as we know, simply exposing someone to the old trauma does not integrate the memory into the overall context of their lives, and it rarely restores them to the level of joyful engagement with people and pursuits they had prior to the trauma. In contrast, EMDR, as well as the treatments discussed in subsequent chapters, internal family systems, yoga, neurofeedback, psychomotor therapy, and theater, focus not only on regulating the intense memories activated by trauma, but also on restoring a sense of agency, engagement, and commitment through ownership of body and mind. Next section, page 256, called Processing Trauma with EMDR. Kathy was a 21-year-old student at a local university. When I first met her, she looked terrified. She had been in psychotherapy for 3 years with a therapist whom she trusted and felt understood by, but with whom she was not making any progress. After her third suicide attempt at her university health service referred her to me, hoping that the technique I'd told them about could help her. Like several of my other traumatized patients, Kathy was able to become completely absorbed in her studies. When she read a book or wrote a research paper, she could block out everything else about her life. This enabled her to be a competent student, even when she had no idea of how to establish a loving relationship with herself, let alone an intimate partner. Kathy told me that her father had used her for many years for child prostitution, which would normally have made me think of using EMDR only as an adjunctive therapy. However, She turned out to be an EMDR virtuoso and recovered completely after 8 sessions, the shortest time thus far in my experience for someone with a history of severe childhood abuse. Those sessions took place 15 years ago, and I recently met with her to discuss the pros and cons of her adopting a 3rd child. She was a delight, smart, funny, and joyfully engaged with her family and her work as an assistant professor of child development. I'd like to share my notes on Kathy's 4th EMDR treatment, not only to demonstrate what typically happens in such a session, but also to reveal the human mind in action as it integrates a traumatic experience. No brain scan, blood test, or rating scale can measure this. And even a video recording convey only a shadow of how EMDR can unleash the imaginative powers of the mind. Kathy sat with her chair at a 45-degree angle to mine so that we were about 4 feet apart. I asked her to bring a particularly painful memory to mind and encouraged her to recall what she had heard, saw, thought, and felt in her body as it took place. My records do not show whether she told me what the particular memory was. My guess is probably not, since I did not write it down. I asked her whether she was now in the memory, and when she said yes, I asked her how real it felt on a scale of 1 to 10. About a 9, she said. Then I asked her to follow my moving finger with her eyes. From time to time, after completing a set of about 25 eye movements, I might say, take a deep breath, followed by, what do you get now? Or what comes to mind now? Kathy would then tell me what she was thinking. Whenever her tone of voice, facial expression, body movements, or breathing patterns indicated that this was an emotionally significant theme, I would say, notice that. And another set of eye movements, during which she did not speak. Other than uttering those few words, I remained silent for the next 45 minutes. Here is the association Kathy reported after the first eye movement sequence. I realize that I have scars from when he tied my hands behind my back. The other scar is when he marked me to claim me as his. And there, she points, are bite marks. She looked stunned, but surprisingly calm as she recalled. I remember being doused in gasoline. He took Polaroid pictures of me, and then I was submerged in water. I was gang raped by my father and 2 of his friends. I was tied to a table. I remember them raping me with Budweiser bottles. My stomach was clenching, but I didn't comment beyond asking Kathy to keep those memories in mind. After about 30 more back and forth movements, I stopped when I saw that she was smiling. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, I was in a karate class. It was great. I really kicked butt. I saw them backing off. I yelled, don't you see you are hurting me? I'm not your girlfriend. I said, stay there, and began the next sequence. When it ended, Kathy said, I have an image of 2 me's, this smart, pretty little girl and that little slut. All these women who could not take care of themselves or me or their men, leaving it up to me to call me to service all these men. She started to sob during the next sequence, and then we stopped. She said, I saw how little I was, the brutalization of the little girl. It was not my fault. I nodded and said, that's right, stay there. The next round ended with Kathy reporting, I'm picturing my life now. My big me holding my little me, saying, you are safe now. I nodded encouragingly and continued. The images kept coming. I have pictures of a bulldozer flattening the house I grew up in. It's over. Then Kathy started on a different track. I am thinking about how much I like Jeffrey, a boy in one of her classes, thinking he might not want to hang out with me, thinking I can't handle it. I have never been someone's girlfriend before, and I don't know how. I asked her what she thought she needed to know and began the next sequence. Now there is a person who just wants to be with me. It is too simple. I don't know how to just be myself around men. I'm petrified. As she tracked my finger, Kathy started to sob. When I stopped, she told me, I had an image of Jeffrey and me sitting in the coffee house. My father comes in the door. He starts screaming at the top of his lungs, and he is wielding an axe. He says, I told you that you belong to me. He puts me on top of the table, then he rapes me, and then he rapes Jeffrey. She was crying hard now. How can you be open with somebody when you have visions of your dad raping you and then raping us both? I wanted to comfort her, but I knew it was more important to keep her associations moving. I asked her to focus on what she felt in her body. I feel it in my forearms, in my shoulders, and my right chest. I just want to be held. We continued the EMDR when we stopped, and Kathy looked relaxed. I heard Jeffrey say, it's okay, that he was sent here to take care of me, and that it was not anything that I did, and that he just wants to be with me for my sake. Again, I asked what she felt in her body. I feel really peaceful, a little bit shaky, like when you're using new muscles, some relief. Jeffrey knows all this already. I feel like I'm alive and that it is all over, but I'm afraid that my father has another little girl, and that makes me very, very sad. I want to save her. But as we continued, the trauma returned. Together with other thoughts and images, I need to throw up. I have intrusions of lots of smells, bad cologne, alcohol, vomit. A few minutes later, Kathy is crying profusely. I really feel my mom here now. It feels like she wants me to forgive her. I have the sense that the same thing happened to her. She is apologizing to me over and over. She's telling me that this happened to her, that it was my grandfather. She's also telling me that my grandmother is really sorry for not being there to protect me. I kept asking her to take deep breaths and stay with whatever was coming up. At the end of the next sequence, Kathy said, I feel like it's over. I felt my grandmother holding me at my current age, telling me that she is so sorry she married my grandfather, that she and my mom are making sure that it stops here. After one final EMDR sequence, Kathy was smiling. I have an image of pushing my father out of the coffee house and Jeffrey locking the door behind him. He stands outside. You can see him through the glass. Everybody's making fun of him. With the help of EMDR, Kathy was able to integrate the memories of her trauma and call on her imagination to help her lay them to rest, arriving at a sense of completion and control. She did so with minimal input from me and without any discussion of the particulars of her experiences. I never felt a reason to question their accuracy. Her experiences were real to her, and my job was to help her deal with them in the present. The process freed something in her brain to activate new images, feelings, and thoughts. It was as if her life force emerged to create new possibilities for her future. As we've seen, traumatic memories persist as split off, unmodified images, sensations, and feelings. To my mind, the most remarkable feature of EMDR is its apparent capacity to activate a series of unsought and seemingly unrelated sensations, emotions, images, and thoughts in conjunction with the original memory. This way of reassembling old information into new packages may be just the way we integrate ordinary, non-traumatic day-to-day experiences. So, new section here. We are on page 259, and it's called Exploring the Sleep Connection. If you are enjoying this video, please remember to click the like. And if you're not subscribed, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the Alchemist Tribe. Okay, so Exploring the Sleep Connection, page 259. Shortly after learning about EMDR, I was asked to speak about my work at the sleep laboratory headed by Alan Hobson at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. Hobson, together with his teacher, Michael Jouvet, was famous for discovering where dreams are generated in the brain, and one of his research assistants, Robert Stickgold, was just then beginning to explore the function of dreams. I showed the group a videotape of a patient who had suffered from severe PTSD for 13 years after a terrible car accident, and who, in only 2 sessions of EMDR, had transformed from a helpless, panicked victim into a confident, assertive woman. Bob was fascinated. A few weeks later, a friend of Stick Gold's family became so depressed after the death of her cat that she had to be hospitalized. The attending psychiatrist concluded that the cat's death had triggered unresolved memories of the death of the woman's mother when she was 12, and he connected her with Roger Solomon, a well-known EMDR trainer, who treated her successfully. Afterward, she called Stick Gold and said, "Bob, you have to study this. It's really strange. It has to do with your brain, not your mind." Soon after, an article appeared in the journal Dreaming, suggesting that EMDR was related to rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, the phase of sleep in which dreaming occurs. Research had already shown that sleep, and dream sleep in particular, plays a major role in mood regulation. As the article in Dreaming pointed out, the eyes move rapidly back and forth in REM sleep, just as they do in EMDR. Increasing our time in REM sleep reduces depression, while the less REM sleep we get, the more likely we are to become depressed. Of course, PTSD is notoriously associated with disturbed sleep, and self-medication of alcohol or drugs further disrupts REM sleep. During my my colleagues and I found that the veterans with PTSD frequently woke themselves up soon after going into REM sleep, probably because they had activated a trauma fragment during a dream. Other researchers have also noticed this phenomenon, but thought that it was irrelevant to understanding PTSD. Today, we know that both deep sleep and REM sleep play important roles in how memories change over time. The sleeping brain reshapes memory by increasing the imprint of emotionally relevant information while helping irrelevant material fade away. In a series of elegant studies, Stick Gold and his colleagues showed that the sleeping brain can even make sense out of information whose relevance is unclear while we are awake and integrate it into the larger memory system. Dreams keep replaying, recombining, and reintegrating pieces of old memories for months and even years. They constantly update the subterranean realities that determine what our waking minds pay attention to. And perhaps most relevant to EMDR, in REM sleep, we activate more distant associations than in either non-REM sleep or the normal waking state. For example, when subjects are wakened from non-REM sleep and given a word association test, they give standard responses: hot, cold, hard, soft, etc. Wakened from REM sleep, they make less conventional connections, such as thief, long. They also solve simple anagrams more easily after REM sleep. This shift toward activation of distant associations could explain why dreams are so bizarre. Stick Gold, Hobson, and their colleagues thus discovered that dreams help to forge new relationships between apparently unrelated memories. Seeing novel connections is the cardinal feature of creativity. As we've seen, it's also essential to healing. The inability to recombine experiences is also one of the striking features of PTSD. While Noam in Chapter 4 could imagine a trampoline to save future victims of terrorism, traumatized people are trapped in frozen associations. Anybody who wears a turban will try to kill me. A man who finds me attractive wants to rape me. Finally, Stick Gold suggests a clear link between EMDR and memory processing in dreams. If the bilateral stimulation of EMDR can alter brain states in a manner similar to that seen during REM sleep, then there is now good evidence that EMDR should be able to take advantage of sleep-dependent processes, which may be blocked or ineffective in PTSD sufferers, to allow effective memory processing and trauma resolution. The basic EMDR instruction, hold that image in your mind and just watch my fingers moving back and forth, may very well produce what happens in the dreaming brain. As this book is going to press, Ruth Linnaeus and I are studying how the brain reacts, both while remembering a traumatic event and an ordinary experience. to saccadic eye movements as subjects lie in an fMRI scanner. Stay tuned. Okie doke. So we are on our next section, page 261. This is called association and integration. Unlike conventional exposure treatment, EMDR spends very little time revisiting the original trauma. The trauma itself is certainly the starting point, but the focus is on stimulating and opening up the associative process. As our Prozac EMDR study showed, drugs can blunt the images and sensations of terror, but they remain embedded in the mind and body. In contrast with the subjects who improved on Prozac, whose memories were merely blunted, not integrated as an event that happened in the past, and still caused considerable anxiety, those who received EMDR no longer experienced the distinct imprints of the trauma. It had become a story of a terrible event that had happened a long time ago. As one of my patients said, making a dismissive hand gesture, "It's over." While we don't yet know precisely how EMDR works, the same is true of Prozac. Prozac has an effect on serotonin, but whether its levels go up or down and in which brain cells and why that makes people feel less afraid is still unclear. We likewise don't know precisely why talking to a trusted friend gives such profound relief. And I'm surprised how few people seem eager to explore that question. Clinicians have only one obligation: to do whatever they can to help their patients get better. Because of this, clinical practice has always been a hotbed for experimentation. Some experiments fail, some succeed, and some, like EMDR, dialectical behavior therapy, and internal family systems therapy, go on to change the way therapy is practiced. Validating all these treatments takes decades and is hampered by the fact that research support generally goes to methods that have already been proven to work. I am much comforted by considering the history of penicillin. Almost 4 decades passed between the discovery of its antibiotic properties by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and the final elucidation of its mechanisms in 1965. That is the end of that chapter. We have a few more pages to go. We are moving on to chapter 16, you all. This is called Learning to Inhabit Your Body. So now we are getting into the mind-body connection in terms of movement. This is exciting because if some of you all know, I used to be a personal trainer and help people to shape and shift their bodies and to heal on that level. So, and my master's is in exercise science. So I find this very intriguing and it's very dear to my heart. So, and I've also experienced my own weight loss journey and healing trauma through that. So here we go, enough chit chat. Okay, chapter 16, Learning to Inhabit Your Body, Yoga. Starting out with a quote by Stephen Cope from Yoga and the Quest for the True Self. It says, "As we begin to re-experience a visceral reconnection with the needs of our bodies, there is a brand new capacity to warmly love the self. We experience a new quality of authenticity in our caring, which redirects our attention to our health, our diets, our energy, our time management. This enhanced care for the self arises spontaneously and naturally, not as a response to a should. We are able to experience an immediate and intrinsic pleasure and self-care." That's beautiful. Okie doke. I'm going to grab a drink really quickly. Okie doke. Starting the chapter. The first time I saw Annie, she was slumped over in a chair in my waiting room, wearing faded jeans and a purple Jimmy Cliff t-shirt. Her legs were visibly shaking, and she kept staring at the floor even after I invited her in. I had very little information about her other than that she was 47 years old and taught special needs children. Her body communicated clearly that she was too terrified to engage in conversation or even to provide routine information about her address or insurance plan. People who are this scared can't think straight, and any demand to perform will only make them shut down further. If you insist, they'll run away and you'll never see them again. Annie shuffled into my office and remained standing, barely breathing, like a frozen bird. I knew we couldn't do anything until I could help her quiet down. Moving to within 6 feet of her and making sure she had unobstructed access to the door, I encouraged her to take slightly deeper breaths. I breathed with her and asked her to follow my example, gently raising my arms from my sides as she inhaled and lowering them as I exhaled. A Qigong technique that one of my Chinese students had taught me. She stealthily followed my movements, her eyes still fixed on the floor. We spent about half an hour this way. From time to time, I quietly asked her to notice how her feet felt against the floor and how her chest expanded and contracted with each breath. Her breath gradually became slower and deeper. Her face softened, her spine straightened a bit, and her eyes lifted to about the level of my Adam's apple. I began to sense the person behind that overwhelming terror. Finally, she looked more relaxed and showed me the glimmer of her smile, a recognition that we both were in the room. I suggested that we stop there for now. I'd made enough demands on her and asked whether she would like to come back a week later. She nodded and muttered, "You sure are weird." As I got to know Annie, I inferred from the notes she wrote and the drawings she gave me that she had been dreadfully abused by both her father and her mother as a very young child. The full story was only gradually revealed as she slowly learned to call up some of the things that had happened to her without her body being hijacked into uncontrollable anxiety. I learned that Annie was extraordinarily skilled and caring in her work with special needs kids. I tried out quite a few of the techniques she told me about with the children in her own clinic and found them extremely helpful. She would talk freely about the children she taught, but would clam up immediately if we verged on her relationships with adults. I knew she was married, but she barely mentioned her husband. She often coped with disagreements and confrontations by making her mind disappear. When she felt overwhelmed, she'd cut her arms and breast with a razor blade. She had spent years in various forms of therapy and had tried many different medications, which had done little to help her deal with the imprints of her horrendous past. She had also been admitted to several psychiatric hospitals to manage her self-destructive behaviors, again, without much apparent benefit. In our early therapy sessions, because Annie could only hint at what she was feeling and thinking before she would shut down and freeze, we focused on calming the psychological chaos within. We used every technique that I had learned over the years, like breathing with a focus on the out-breath, which activates the relaxing parasympathetic nervous system. I also taught her to use her fingers to tap a sequence of acupressure points on various parts of her body, a practice often taught under the name EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, which has been shown to help patients stay within the window of tolerance and often has positive effects on PTSD symptoms. Okay, next section within this chapter, page 265, it is called, excuse me, it's called The Legacy of Inescapable Shock. Because we can now identify the brain circuits involved in the alarm system, we know more or less what is happening in Annie's brain as she sat that first day in the waiting room. Her smoke detector, her amygdala, had been rewired to interpret certain situations as harbingers of life-threatening danger, and it was sending urgent signals to her survival brain to fight, freeze, or flee. Annie had all these reactions simultaneously. She was visibly agitated and mentally shut down. As we've seen, broken alarm systems can manifest in various ways, and if your smoke detector malfunctions, you cannot trust the accuracy of your perceptions. For example, when Annie started to like me, she began to look forward to our meetings. But she would arrive at my office in an intense panic. One day, she had a flashback of feeling excited that her father was coming home soon, but later that evening, he molested her. For the first time, she realized that her mind automatically associated excitement about seeing someone she loved with the terror of being molested. Small children are particularly adept at compartmentalizing experience, so that Annie's natural love for her father and her dread of assaults were held in separate states of consciousness. As an adult, Annie blamed herself for her abuse because she believed that the loving, excited little girl she once was had led her father on, that she had brought the molestation upon herself. Her rational mind told her this was nonsense, but this belief emanated from deep within her emotional survival brain, from the basic wiring of her limbic system. It would not change until she felt safe enough within her body to mindfully go back into that experience and truly know how that little girl had felt and acted during the abuse. Next section, same page 265, called the numbing within. One of the ways the memory of helplessness is stored is as muscle tension or feelings of disintegration in the affected body areas, head, neck, and limbs in accident victims, vagina and rectum in victims of sexual abuse. The lives of many trauma survivors come to revolve around bracing against the neutralizing unwanted sensory experiences. I'm sorry, let me start that over. The lives of many trauma survivors come to revolve around bracing against and neutralizing unwanted sensory experiences, and most people see in my practice have become experts in such self-numbing. Most people I see. They become serially obese or anorexic or addicted to exercise or work. At least half of all traumatized people try to dull their intolerable inner world with drugs or alcohol. The flip side of numbing is sensation seeking. Many people cut themselves to make the numbing go away, while others try bungee jumping or high-risk activities like prostitution and gambling. Any of these methods can give them a false sense of paradoxical feeling of control. When people are chronically angry or scared, constant muscle tension ultimately leads to spasms, back pain, migraine headaches, fibromyalgia, and other forms of chronic pain. They may visit multiple specialists, undergo extensive diagnostic tests, and be prescribed multiple medications, some of which may provide temporary relief, but all of which fail to address the underlying issues. Their diagnosis will come to define the reality without ever being identified as a symptom of their attempt to cope with trauma. True. In the first 2 years of my therapy with Annie, I totally just made that sentence up. Okay, let me start again. The first 2 years of my therapy with Annie focused on helping her learn to tolerate her physical sensations for what they were. Just sensations in the present with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We worked on helping her stay calm enough to notice what she felt without judgment, so she could observe these unbidden images and feelings as residues of a terrible past and not as unending threats to her life today. Patients like Annie continuously challenge us to find new ways of helping people regulate their arousal and control their own physiology. That is how my trauma center colleagues and I stumbled upon yoga. Okay, new section, page 266. This is our last page turn today, y'all. So it's called Finding Our Way to Yoga, Bottom-Up Regulation. Our involvement in yoga started in 1998 when Jim Hopper and I first heard about a new biological marker, heart rate variability, or HRV, that had recently been discovered to be a good measure of how well the autonomic nervous system is working. As you'll recall from chapter 5, the autonomic nervous system is our brain's most elementary survival system. It's 2 branches regulating arousal throughout the body. Roughly speaking, the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, uses chemicals like adrenaline to fuel the body and brain to take action, while the parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS, uses acetylcholine to help regulate basic body functions like digestion, wound healing, and sleep and dream cycles. When we're at our best, these 2 systems work closely together to keep us in optimal state of engagement with our environment and with ourselves. Heart rate variability measures the relative balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. When we inhale, we stimulate the SNS, which results in an increase in heart rate. Exhalations stimulate the PNS, which decreases how fast the heart beats. In healthy individuals, Inhalations and exhalations produce steady, rhythmical fluctuations in heart rate. Good heart rate variability is a measure of basic well-being. Why is HRV important? When our autonomic nervous system is well balanced, we have a reasonable degree of control over our response to minor frustrations and disappointments, enabling us to calmly assess what is going on when we feel insulted or left out. Effective arousal modulation gives us control over our impulses and emotions. As long as we manage to stay calm, we can choose how we want to respond. Individuals with poorly modulated autonomic nervous systems are easily thrown off balance, but both mentally and physically. Since the autonomic nervous system organizes arousal in both brain and body, poor HRV, that is, a lack of fluctuation in heart rate in response to breathing, not only has negative effects on thinking and feeling, but also on how the body responds to stress. Lack of coherence between breathing and heart rate makes people vulnerable to a variety of physical illnesses, such as heart disease and cancer, in addition to mental problems such as depression and PTSD. In order to study this issue further, we acquired a machine to measure HRV and started to put bands around the chests of research subjects with and without PTSD to record the depth and rhythm of their breathing, while little monitors attached to their earlobes picked up their pulse. After we tested about 60 subjects, it became clear that people with PTSD have unusually low HRV. In other words, in PTSD, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are out of sync. This added a new twist to the complicated trauma story. We confirmed that yet another brain regulatory system is not functioning as it should. Failure to keep this system in balance is one explanation why traumatized people like Annie are so vulnerable to over-respond to relatively minor stresses. The biological systems that are meant to help us cope with the vagaries of life fail to meet the challenge. Our next scientific question is there a way for people to improve their HRV? I had a personal incentive to explore this question, as I had discovered that my own HRV was not nearly robust enough to guarantee long-term health. An internet search turned up studies showing that marathon running markedly increased HRV. Sadly, that was of little use since neither I nor my patients were good candidates for the Boston Marathon. Google also listed 17,000 yoga sites claiming that yoga improved HRV, but we were unable to find any supporting studies. Yogis may have developed a wonderful method to help people find internal balance and health, but back in 1998, not much work had been done on evaluating their claims with the tools of the Western medical condition. Since then, however, scientific methods have confirmed that changing the way one breathes can improve problems with anger, depression, and anxiety, and that yoga can positively affect such wide-ranging medical problems as high blood pressure, elevated stress hormone secretion, asthma, and low back pain. However, no psychiatric journal had published a scientific study for yoga for PTSD until our own work appeared in 2014. As it happened, a few days after our internet search, a lanky yoga teacher named David Emerson walked through the front door of the trauma center. He told us that he'd developed a modified form of hatha yoga to deal with PTSD, and that he'd been holding classes for veterans at a local vet center and for women in the Boston area rape crisis center. Would we be interested in working with him? Dave's visit eventually grew into a very active yoga program, and in due course, we received the first grant from the National Institutes of Health to study the effects of yoga on PTSD. Dave's work also contributed to my developing my own regular yoga practice and becoming a frequent teacher at Kripalu, a yoga center in the Berkshire Mountains in Western Massachusetts. Along the way, my own HRV pattern improved as well. In choosing to explore yoga to improve HRV, we are taking an expansive approach to the problem. We could simply have used any of a number of reasonably priced handheld devices that train people to slow their breathing and synchronize it with their heart rate, resulting in a state of cardiac coherence, like the pattern shown in the first illustration above, and I'll show you those after. Today, there are a variety of apps that can help improve HRV and with the aid of a smartphone. In our clinic, we have workstations where patients can train their HRV, and I urge all my patients who, for one reason or another, cannot practice yoga, martial arts, or Qigong to train themselves at home. Okay, so here are the charts on the side. This first one shows a graph of heart rate variability in a well-regulated person. It says the rising and falling black lines represent breathing, in this case, slow and regular inhalations and exhalations. The gray area shows fluctuations in heart rate, whether the individual inhales, whenever this individual inhales, his heart rate goes up. During exhalations, the heart slows down. The pattern of heart rate variability reflects excellent physiological health. So here is when they said the black line, what did they say? The gray area is the fluctuations in heart rate. The black line is the breathing. So for the most part, the breathing's pretty steady. There's like a peak right there, but it's a pretty even graph there. So this is somebody that's physiologically healthy. The next one is responding to upset. When someone remembers an upsetting experience, breathing speeds up and becomes irregular, as does heart rate. Heart and breath no longer stay perfectly in sync. This is a normal response. So if you see from this first graph, like the breath is pretty much aligned with the peaks. The peak of the breath and the peak of the heart rate right here is pretty much aligned. As you see this one, when somebody is upset, the length of the wave gets shorter. So it's like, like quicker inhalations, quicker heartbeat, beat, things speed up. And then also there's this weird part here where things start to get misaligned, and right there as well. And then HRV and PTSD, breathing is slow, rapid and shallow, Heart rate is slow and out of sync with the breath. This is a typical pattern of a shutdown person with chronic PTSD. So as you see, the fluctuations in heart rate are super, super low. So look at how low that heart rate slows. Breath is still short, it's shallow right there. And it's very misaligned, like it's this to me looks like chest breathing and not going, not getting even close to full lungs capacity right there. This was a little bit better, but see, these peaks are higher, but this one is just like shallow breathing. Okay. And then the very last one, a person with chronic PTSD reliving a trauma memory. Breathing initially is labored and deep, typical of a panic reaction. The heart races out of sync with the breath. This is followed by rapid, shallow breathing and slow heart rate, signs that the person is shutting down. So they have this, first there's this like excitement here, erratic breathing pattern right there, deep breaths going on, erratic breath, and then the breath stays up kind of elevated, and then the heart just like is like, I'm done. Okay, so it's kind of like slowed down there. Shallow breathing and slow heart rate. Yeah. Okay, really interesting. I'll just put this here really quickly, y'all. That's it for today. Just want to show that real quick. That is it for today. We are going to pick up, we're still going to be talking about yoga, looks like, next week. So thank you all so much for being here. Please remember, this was pretty intense, some of the stuff in here. Do whatever you need to do if you feel like you need to like ground yourself after this, or just refocus your energy, because there was some pretty serious topics that were mentioned here. So if you or anyone you know is dealing with like thoughts of suicide or hurting yourself, please look at I have links in this description box below. But you all just please be gentle with yourself. A lot of us are working through a lot of really heavy things and having a lot of suppressed trauma come up. So be very loving, very gentle, care for yourself. I love that they talked about childhood trauma, or like parenting the inner child during the EMDR section where the woman was seeing her baby self, or like her younger self. If that helps you all, do that as well. But this is such a beautiful time and such an important time for us to practice self-love for ourselves first, and then to accept and receive it from others as well. And to give it to others as well, because we're all shifting and transforming and just having lots of trauma come up. So please remember that. All right, you all, like the video, subscribe, share it if you feel like it would be valuable to someone you know. Also, I have my booking link down below if you'd like to book a private tarot reading with me. That's down below. Also, my Patreon is there, and my link tree where you can find everything for me, including donation tips or donation links, and the buy me a coffee link. So if you would like to donate and support my channel, that really does help me out, and I really appreciate all of the energy and the effort that you all put back into me. It does not go unnoticed. So that is all for today. Thank you all so much for being here. You are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. Please remember that. I love you. Bye.